David Talbot, welcome to the Resolution Room.
Thank you very much.
I want to talk to you about your recent research and what that tells you around culture, generational engagement, etc. But let's talk first about your backstory. You've been in the research game. You're part of Talbot Mills, the Enactor group. You've been around politics, the back rooms, the dark arts. You've worked for Jacinda Ardern in a previous life, and you're very familiar with both the Australian and New Zealand and international landscape. Is that a fair summary, David? Have I missed anything?
No, that's good. The gag I usually tell is that I come from a kind of a medical background, a medical family, but really didn't like blood at all. Switched to cycling, really decided I didn't like blood and cycling at all as well, and so found myself almost accidentally in politics.
And you worked for Jacinda Ardern. What role did you have with her?
So I worked for a sort of a series of unsuccessful Labor leaders prior to her arrival on the scene. I was already running the polling company at the time that she became the Prime Minister, but through that COVID period, sort of worked far more closely with her and her staffers than had been the case previously.
What drew you to research in particular, Dave? Why that?
I think I've always been fascinated with how people see the world. And yeah, the opportunity to kind of connect that to the sort of political things that I was interested in was always massively appealing. So I come from a sort of a communications and campaigning background. And when I got the call one day from my former business partner to kind of join the polling company, I jumped at the chance.
That's fantastic. So now you're part of a bespoke research business and the Enactor group. And I've got in front of me a workplace culture survey report. So let's drill down on that. But before we do, talk about the general methodology of the research you undertook.
So what we often do when we're surveying is we look for a representative sample of Australians. And so what that means, there's kind of good surveys and there's poor surveys. They're often determined by the robustness of the methodology that's employed to collect the information. In this case, we surveyed around 1,000 Australians. But what we do is we try very hard to make sure that it's a representative group. It's not like a kind of an online survey you might see the results of where people have logged into a news website and voted yes or no to whether they like somebody. It's a far more robust and scientific process. So the 1,000 people are a representative weighted sample of the Australian public that match the demographics of the census in terms of gender and location and age and a number of other kind of features. So we can have very high confidence in the kind of reliability of the figures that we present.
Well, that's really interesting because when I looked at it and we discussed it, there were some surprises, and I want to go through that. The purpose of this conversation is to sort of drill down on what the numbers tell us from a generational perspective and how that feeds into leadership and leadership strategies. Let's start with the first page. One of the thing I thought was really interesting was the question, how important are the following to get right when deciding on a new job? Pay and job security, the old chestnuts, are really quite high, particularly in the modern cultural speak where people talk about other cultural attributes. But the core issue still of pay and security still loom really large.
That's absolutely right. I mean, those dominated across all the age groups. And I think you, like me, have probably heard that sort of myth that, the way to attract Gen Z is a few beanbags and a foosball table. This kind of survey, the results we've got here, I think really dispel that myth as the way to appeal to kind of younger members of a workplace.
Yeah, I thought it was all about kombucha and stilled water, M&M machines, but apparently not.
That's right. I was in an office of a tech company a week or so ago elsewhere in the world. They had a muesli of the week, which I thought was, fantastic, I guess, if you like muesli, but perhaps peripheral to the kind of core things that people are telling us they really care about and want prioritized.
Yeah, and it really drilled down. The next slide really summed it up as well, because in the age group 18 to 29, which is, that generation, my son who's starting out in law is in that category. 56% rated pay, 51% rated job security in terms of what were the factors to get right. So again, that's really age specific and really interesting.
It is. And I think values and culture sort of are part of the mix for people across the age groups. And they are something that matters to younger respondents as well, but they're just not a substitute for the basics. So I think that, in terms of sort of what businesses and business leaders need to hear is that, it is kind of about balance. It is about appreciating the need for kind of culture, supportive work environment, clear lines of accountability, all those kind of things. But you can't actually think that those are a substitute for the security, the advancement opportunities, and the base pay.
I thought that was fascinating, particularly because of that myth that we spoke about. Let's talk a bit about what makes a good workplace culture. But before I do, I know you have a broader political landscape. Do you think that those numbers are a feature of the cost of living crisis, if I could call it that? Perhaps that's a bit too much hyperbole, the crisis, but the cost of living issues that we see pay and security so front and centre.
We've done surveys like this elsewhere in the world previously, even prior to COVID, and the results are actually quite consistent between what we're seeing now and the ones we've seen previously, even though the geographical markets weren't quite the same. So I think that it's quite likely that, as you say, those features could be somewhat heightened in the current climate. But I think that fundamentally, what young people starting out are telling us is that, the pay, the security, and the advancement opportunities, are the things that are of primary importance, almost irrespective of kind of when you measure them. And as I said before, that's not to say that those other things aren't important, but just that they're not a substitute.
Yeah, it really goes to the point that the next generation, or this generation, the younger people, aren't that different perhaps than my own or yours.
Quite possibly, quite possibly. And I think there is often a temptation to think that, people who are coming through the next generation are entirely different. We see a lot of it in politics. People talk about the crisis of the youth vote, that young people aren't voting. But, a lot of research seems to show that, young people tend not to vote at the start of their lives when they're a bit less connected to communities and, some of the decisions that government are making, but that engagement, often rises over time as you get a mortgage, get a job, and get other responsibilities and a focus. So I think it is quite easy to say that, young people are sort of vastly different. But, perhaps it's a bit about life stage. Perhaps it's about some fundamental things that, make us human beings.
Yeah. The next slide was also important. What is the most important when it comes to having a good workplace culture? And what I thought was interesting was that there wasn't a standout in this slide. If you look at sort of a non-toxic environment, 19%, mutual respect, 17%, teamwork and relationships were the next at 15%, a number of other factors. But pay, conditions and balance in that sense was only 6%. What did you make of that in terms of your analysis of what makes a good workplace culture?
This is an interesting example of how asking the question can, in a different way, can really determine the kind of focus that a respondent brings to the response they give. And so we often do a combination of things in a survey. We ask a prompted list of features and we ask people to rank the importance of those. And then we might ask an open-ended question that tries to give a bit more colour to some of the answers or some of the nuances of the topic. And I think what's happening here is that when we're asking specifically about what makes good workplace culture, even using the word culture probably pulls people into a slightly different frame than if we were talking about, kind of career advancement opportunities and money. And so what bubbles up to the top is this kind of collection of ideas that we would see as all contributions to the culture of a workplace. And you see that then distributed amongst those answers that you've read out.
I didn't think any of those attributes were startling, really, things that we know about that makes a good workplace culture, respect, communication, concepts around psychological safety, etc.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I think for people who are in charge of workplaces, who are running workplaces, making sure that there's a list that includes all of those things so that none are being neglected, and the knowledge that, different things might be important to different people. And so what you'd be trying to do is to look through that list that you've got there in front of you and make sure that you are ticking the box off, essentially. Are people getting the support they need? Are there clear lines of accountability? Do people feel like their contribution is valued? If any of those things start to slip off the radar, I think that's the time when you'd have a, potential problem on your hands.
Absolutely. The next thing, which I thought was comforting in a way, was that most people are reasonably positive about their current workplace cultures, despite the hyperbolic end, perhaps.
That's right. Like, I think we saw about three-quarters, I think it was, of respondents were positive about their current workplace culture. I guess the sort of watch out is that, the outliers were some people working in sales roles where it was a bit lower, it was closer to half. So, potentially some of those kind of pressures and the kind of fast-moving nature of that environment is having an impact on that figure. But like a really strong figure that I think, kind of businesses around the country can be quite proud of. But as you say, like room for improvement on some metrics. I think we had just over half, 56%, saying that was often a bit too much office politics, and we had almost half saying I frequently dread going to work. So, people are happy with office culture, but there are some things beneath the surface that are probably worth keeping an eye on.
Absolutely. And not much differentiation on age too when you looked at that metric.
No, and I think that's one of the kind of interesting things throughout the survey was that some of those things that I probably expected to see around big differences on some of the factors based on sort of life stage or age just weren't evident in the results.
And the next question, I guess, for you is, why do men like hanging out with colleagues more than women? What's that about?
Quite a strange one there. Yeah, that's where we'd sort of, we'd always recommend pairing qualitative research with the quantitative research. And what you often see in quant is sort of interesting or surprising things pop up. It'd be great to get a group of men around a table and talk to them about the differences in their kind of working environments than some of the women and see if there was a kind of something real going on there. Be fascinating.
That was really interesting. I thought that was fascinating. When you look at workplace agreement by age, the question was posed, how strongly do you agree or disagree with the following about your workplace? And interestingly, again, looking at the age differentiation, when you looked at factors like, I feel supported by my colleagues, that was pretty non-specific, or in terms of age, that was fairly generic. What did you think of those factors? Was there anything there that jumped out at you in terms of a generational analysis?
I thought the stuff, it might be on the next page, that really kind of stood out in terms of the generations for the under 30s, that they seem to approach kind of work with that more sort of mobility first mindset. And I guess that is probably just, about career stage as much as it is about age. But they ranked career development opportunities quite a bit higher in terms of importance. And they were also much more open to changing jobs and more actively scanning the market than other age bands were. And so I guess the watch out there for employers is that we all need to be doing more probably to nurture and retain talent at a time when they're a bit less connected to their current workplace probably, and always on the lookout, for new opportunities, is what they seem to be telling us in this survey.
I agree. And I thought, as a former leader in professional services, is that with younger people, the importance of career development and having those conversations early and mapping out a pathway. And I don't think we're doing that nearly well enough. I think there's the old analysis that the rule book traditionally applies and people will float to the top and they don't need much, they'll learn by osmosis. But really what we're seeing here is the younger generation want a sense of a career path and development and that notion of progression.
I think so. And the kind of like more active support to kind of make it happen. Not just because of the results of this survey, but I've brought into our business a former colleague whose specific job now will be sort of pastoral care and career development with some of the younger staff that we've brought on board, because they were kind of telling us in a variety of ways, and not through this survey, but conversations really, that they were interested in sort of other opportunities in the business and ways to get involved in a wider range of things. So we're trying to more actively kind of manage that process than we have in the past.
I think that's a great learning. And in my former role, I was reminded of the fact that we often had a blind spot, which is we thought that careers would develop like our own had developed. But I think that craving for variety, for other opportunities, change and progression is really quite important.
I think so. And, the other thing, that really stood out in this survey was that there seems to be disquiet building around the impacts of AI in the workforce. And that came through much more strongly from the younger respondents in the survey than the older ones. And that's going to be another force that kind of speaks to exactly what you've flagged.
Let's talk about AI. I don't know if you saw yesterday, Thomson Reuters share price, a legal tech provider, tanked a bit. I think it's Anthropic, and a big AI business spawned out of OpenAI is coming into this space. But what I thought from another survey you sent was there was probably not as much pessimism around AI as I perhaps expected. Is that a fair summary?
I think so. I think, people are broadly, and I'm sort of talking in generalizations and then I can unpack it a bit in detail, but broadly kind of they do see benefits. And a lot of people who are using AI in their personal lives and in their workplaces are seeing efficiencies and seeing kind of personal benefits that they find it quite easy to point to. So, people, if you talk to them in a focus group, might talk about, help with proofreading or writing email or, dealing with first drafts of reports, or in their personal life, it might be, counseling. It might be somebody to talk to.
Yeah.
Recipes or travel advice. So no shortage of those kinds of things. But on the other side, they're also worried about sort of some existential stuff. If AI would have become sentient, would it wipe us out? We often see sort of well above 50% of people saying that's a serious concern to them. A bunch of AI experts that I talk to sometimes tell me that that's not the most sort of proximate threat, but, it's clearly on people's minds. They also worry about mis and disinformation and some of the ways that AI might be used, in kind of those kind of scenarios. Another segment who are worried about their own jobs. So no shortage of positives, no shortage of negatives, and people kind of often in two minds about where they land.
From the perspective of professional services, I'm seeing, for example, pull back on the clerkship, junior talent pool. We saw Baker McKenzie yesterday make job cuts. Do you think that that's affecting a sense of morale and the future amongst the young people? And how do we keep them engaged and develop the professional skills that they need in an AI environment?
I think that's a absolutely key challenge. I don't have an easy answer, but you're absolutely right to identify that as a concern. I mentioned the sort of disquiet that was building in that generation around the effects of AI. And these are people, a lot of young people would be the first to put up their hand and say, it's a fantastic tool and it drives efficiencies and I can see how it would be great for both me and the economy. But when we asked in the survey, well over half, 62% of those under 30 agreed with the statement, my job will likely be replaced by tech or AI in the next 5 years. So you've got 6 in 10, you've got over 6 in 10 young people saying that they expect their job to disappear in the next 5 years. And so, again, you'd want to investigate that qualitatively, but it will impact morale, it will impact planning, it will impact commitment, it will have massive effects.
And also the broader political landscape, because those people are more likely to feel locked out of the housing market as well. And then the idea that a regular job won't lead to a house, but even the regular job, if I can call it that, might be under threat.
And that sort of sense, I think, that, the real worry is we talked to a segment of, predominantly young men in some focus groups a little while ago a lot of them were sort of quite active in the tech sector as coders and programmers. They were already seeing really significant disruption in their kind of sector. they felt like they'd done the right thing. They'd been told, 10 years ago that, if you could learn to code, that would be the future. That was going to be the place that innovation was being driven from. They were excited about it. They've now got student loans. They've kind of like invested heavily in this career, and they can see it kind of disappearing around them. So anxiety levels are high. They're feeling insecure. They might have to retrain. There'll be, policy questions there for government about kind of how you manage that, as well as the kind of potential fractures that occur when people feel like they've followed the rules, but are now being, in inverted commas, penalised. Huge challenges.
Absolutely, David. I've got to wrap it up, but I really appreciate your time and expertise. And I hope in due course, when this pod is released, we'll talk further about those numbers and what they tell us, and perhaps give some headlines for people to draw on.
Absolutely love to. Real pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks, David. All the best.
See you.